What if the most dangerous deception in your life is not a lie, but a truth you refuse to accept? Most people assume they are vulnerable when they are confused, uninformed, or easily manipulated. But history, psychology, and spiritual traditions all point toward a far more uncomfortable possibility. Human beings are often most vulnerable when they are absolutely certain they are right. And that is the paradox hidden beneath one of the most misunderstood entities in Journey to the West. Not because it is a story about demons. Not because it is a story about heroes. But because it is a story about something much closer to home. The human mind. Think about it. How many times have people ignored a warning because it came from the wrong person? How many times have families rejected uncomfortable advice, only to realize its value years later? How many times have entire societies dismissed truth-tellers because the truth threatened a comforting narrative? The pattern repeats everywhere. A warning nobody wanted to hear. A protector standing alone. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. And that is where the real mystery begins. Because the central question is not whether deception exists. Everyone knows deception exists. The real question is why intelligent, moral, well-intentioned people repeatedly choose illusion over reality. Why do we reject the very thing trying to protect us? At first glance, the answer seems simple. We tell ourselves that people are fooled because they lack information. Because they are naive. Because they are careless. But what if the opposite is true? What if the greatest acts of self-sabotage are committed not by people who lack convictions, but by people who are completely convinced of their own goodness? That possibility changes everything. Because once certainty enters the picture, perception begins to change. We stop asking questions. We stop examining assumptions. We stop looking beneath appearances. And slowly, almost invisibly, the desire to be right becomes stronger than the desire to see clearly. This is where Journey to the West transforms from mythology into psychological architecture. The entities are no longer characters. They become functions of consciousness. Archetypes. Forces operating inside every human being. One force seeks comfort. Another seeks truth. One protects identity. Another challenges illusion. And when those forces collide, something remarkable happens. The truth is not always welcomed. In fact, truth often appears threatening long before it appears helpful. That sounds strange, but look around. In modern life, people reject medical advice because it feels frightening. Employees dismiss warnings because they challenge ambition. Friends avoid honest conversations because honesty threatens relationships. Entire communities can attack those who point out uncomfortable realities. The pattern remains the same. The protector becomes the problem. The warning becomes the enemy. The illusion becomes the refuge. And the consequence is rarely immediate. That is what makes it so dangerous. Most destructive mistakes do not feel destructive in the moment. They feel compassionate, reasonable, even noble. Which leads us to an even deeper contradiction. What if good intentions are not enough? What if sincerity alone cannot protect us from self-deception? In Buddhist thought, ignorance is rarely portrayed as simple stupidity. It is often portrayed as attachment. Attachment to beliefs. Attachment to appearances. Attachment to the version of ourselves we desperately want to preserve. And perhaps that is the hidden symbolic layer we keep missing. Perhaps the greatest illusion is not something outside us. Perhaps it is the belief that our own moral certainty guarantees clear vision. If that is true, then the real danger was never deception itself. The real danger was the invisible confidence that made deception possible. And once you begin looking at the story through that lens, a far more unsettling question emerges. What if the most important truth in your life has already appeared, but you rejected it because it arrived in a form you did not want to trust? If the deepest danger is not deception itself, then we have to ask a more unsettling question. Why does the mind cooperate with illusion in the first place? Because that is the part of the pattern most people miss. Illusions rarely survive through intelligence. They survive through emotional necessity. In other words, we do not always believe things because they are true. We often believe them because they protect something we are afraid to lose. A self-image. A worldview. A sense of certainty. A feeling of being a good person. And this is where the symbolic structure becomes much deeper than it first appears. The white bone demon is often interpreted as an external threat. But within the psychological framework of Journey to the West, the more important question is not what the demon represents. The more important question is what allows the demon to function. Because every illusion requires a host. Every deception requires a psychological opening. Every false appearance requires a mind willing to trust appearances. That realization shifts the conflict entirely. The focus moves away from the deceiver and toward the observer. Away from the mask and toward the eyes that cannot see through it. And suddenly, the archetypes begin to reveal their hidden functions. The white bone demon becomes the force of illusion. Not merely falsehood, but distortion. A reality shaped into a form the observer is likely to accept. Meanwhile, the force represented by discernment occupies a very different role. Discernment is rarely comforting. It interrupts narratives. It questions assumptions. It threatens emotional security. That is why a protector standing alone is such a powerful memory fragment. Not because the protector is physically isolated, but because truth itself is often isolated. Especially when everyone else finds comfort in the same illusion. Look closely at modern life and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Organizations ignore internal warnings because the warnings threaten success. Families avoid difficult conversations because honesty threatens harmony. Communities reject uncomfortable facts because facts threaten identity. The mechanism remains the same. A warning nobody wanted to hear. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. And a collective willingness to look away. But here is the contradiction. Most people imagine wisdom and kindness naturally travel together. Journey to the West quietly challenges that assumption. Because kindness without wisdom can become dangerous. And wisdom without acceptance can become powerless. That tension sits at the heart of the spiritual conflict. Not good versus evil. Not innocence versus corruption. But compassion versus discernment. Or more precisely, compassion that has not yet matured into discernment. In Buddhist philosophy, compassion is never meant to function alone. Compassion without wisdom may unintentionally nourish suffering. Wisdom without compassion may become detached and ineffective. Awakening requires both. This is why the symbolic role of moral certainty becomes so important. Moral certainty feels like strength. But spiritually, it can become a form of attachment. Attachment to being right. Attachment to appearing virtuous. Attachment to an identity that cannot tolerate contradiction. And once attachment enters the picture, perception begins to bend. The mind stops seeking truth. Instead, it begins protecting itself. That psychological reversal changes how we interpret human failure. People do not always sabotage themselves because they lack values. Sometimes they sabotage themselves because they become attached to their values. The value itself is not the problem. The attachment is. And the consequences extend far beyond individuals. Scale the pattern outward and entire societies begin operating the same way. Narratives become more important than reality. Comfort becomes more important than clarity. Belonging becomes more important than truth. Civilizations do not lose their way all at once. They drift. One ignored warning at a time. One rejected protector at a time. One comforting illusion at a time. Which brings us closer to the central mystery, but not close enough to solve it. Because even after recognizing how illusion operates, another question remains unanswered. Perhaps the most important question of all. If discernment is so valuable, why does genuine wisdom so often appear threatening, disruptive, and even dangerous before anyone recognizes its value? And what does that reveal about the kind of awakening the pilgrimage is really trying to produce? But what if the problem goes even deeper than attachment? What if the greatest obstacle to awakening is not illusion, not ignorance, and not even fear? What if it is the quiet conviction that we have already understood enough? This is where the symbolic architecture becomes genuinely unsettling. Because the conflict is no longer between truth and falsehood. It becomes a conflict between two different versions of goodness. One version seeks harmony. The other seeks clarity. One wants to protect. The other wants to reveal. At first glance, both appear virtuous. Yet beneath the surface, they move in opposite directions. And that contradiction sits at the center of human history. Again and again, individuals, institutions, and entire civilizations face the same choice. Preserve stability. Or confront reality. Most choose stability. Not because they are malicious. Not because they are foolish. But because reality is expensive. Reality demands sacrifice. Reality forces revision. Reality asks us to abandon cherished assumptions. And that is where the deeper symbolic role of the white bone archetype begins to emerge. The white bone image is not merely a symbol of disguise. It is a symbol of exposure. Bones remain after everything decorative disappears. Titles disappear. Reputations disappear. Appearances disappear. Narratives disappear. Only structure remains. Only what is fundamentally true remains. This is why the image carries such extraordinary psychological weight. Human beings naturally gravitate toward surfaces. We judge confidence as competence. Popularity as wisdom. Familiarity as truth. The visible world becomes our evidence. But the white bone archetype points toward something entirely different. It points beneath appearances. Toward the hidden framework underneath identity itself. And suddenly a disturbing possibility emerges. What if most people are not afraid of deception? What if they are afraid of exposure? Because exposure threatens something far more precious than information. It threatens identity. This creates a profound psychological reversal. We often imagine that truth sets people free immediately. In reality, truth frequently creates resistance. Before it creates freedom. The first reaction to genuine insight is often discomfort. The second is denial. The third is defense. Only much later does understanding become possible. That pattern appears everywhere. In personal relationships. In organizations. In cultures. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. A warning nobody wanted to hear. A protector standing alone. The memory fragments repeat because the underlying psychological structure repeats. And this repetition reveals something important about human nature. People rarely reject truth because it lacks evidence. They reject truth because accepting it would require becoming someone new. That is a much higher price. And now the conflict begins to escalate beyond the individual mind. Because once enough individuals become attached to the same illusion, the illusion becomes collective. A group identity forms around it. A social reality forms around it. Eventually institutions begin protecting it. Then narratives become sacred. Questioning them feels dangerous. Not because the questions are wrong, but because the questions threaten belonging. At that point, illusion evolves into a system. And systems are always harder to challenge than individuals. This is why Buddhist philosophy places such emphasis on attachment. Attachment is not merely wanting something. Attachment is constructing an identity around something. The moment identity becomes involved, perception becomes vulnerable. The mind no longer asks, what is true? The mind begins asking, what preserves who I think I am? That shift is subtle. But it changes everything. Because awakening becomes impossible if identity is more important than reality. And perhaps that is the hidden role played by the shadow function within this symbolic framework. The shadow is not evil. The shadow is whatever we refuse to examine. Whatever we insist cannot be true about ourselves. Whatever remains hidden because our self-image cannot tolerate its existence. The deeper the attachment, the darker the shadow becomes. The darker the shadow becomes, the more fiercely it protects itself. And the more fiercely it protects itself, the more threatening genuine wisdom begins to appear. Now we arrive at a paradox that feels almost impossible to accept. The very qualities people celebrate as moral strengths can sometimes become barriers to awakening. Not because compassion is wrong. Not because goodness is wrong. But because any virtue can become distorted when it becomes part of an identity that refuses examination. Which leads us closer to the central mystery than ever before. Perhaps the real question is not why illusion exists. Perhaps the real question is why awakening so often arrives disguised as a threat. And if genuine wisdom consistently appears dangerous to the unawakened mind, how can anyone recognize it before it is already too late? So how does awakening actually begin? Not with certainty. Not with victory. And not with the comforting feeling that everything finally makes sense. The deeper revelation hidden within this symbolic structure is almost the opposite. Awakening begins when a person becomes willing to distrust the image they have of themselves. That is the layer many people never reach. Because most systems of self-improvement focus on strengthening identity. Journey to the West points toward something far stranger. It points toward loosening identity. The difference may sound subtle, but spiritually it changes everything. A stronger identity can make a person more confident. A looser identity can make a person more perceptive. And perception is the real currency of awakening. This brings us back to the deeper symbolic role of the core entities. The white bone archetype does not merely expose illusion. It exposes attachment to appearances. Not just external appearances. Internal appearances as well. The appearance of being wise. The appearance of being compassionate. The appearance of being righteous. The appearance of being awakened. In Buddhist philosophy, attachment is rarely limited to material possessions. People become attached to beliefs. Attached to roles. Attached to virtues. Attached to stories about who they are. And perhaps the most dangerous attachment of all is attachment to spiritual self-image. Because once a person begins protecting an image of goodness, they may stop pursuing truth. That is the revelation. The obstacle is not evil. The obstacle is self-preservation disguised as virtue. Notice how different that is from the way most people understand personal growth. We often imagine growth as adding something. More knowledge. More confidence. More certainty. More moral authority. But the symbolic journey points toward subtraction. Less illusion. Less attachment. Less identification. Less need to defend the self. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. The image returns again. Not because it belongs to a single character. Because it belongs to human consciousness itself. Truth rarely arrives wrapped in our preferences. It rarely confirms what we already believe. It rarely flatters our identity. Instead, it removes things. Assumptions. Attachments. False certainty. That is why genuine wisdom often feels like loss before it feels like liberation. And this creates a consequence that extends far beyond individual psychology. Entire institutions can become trapped by self-image. Entire cultures can become attached to narratives about themselves. Entire civilizations can begin protecting appearances instead of reality. When that happens, adaptation slows. Perception narrows. Blind spots expand. Eventually the system becomes incapable of seeing what threatens it. Not because the threat is hidden, but because the system has become emotionally invested in not seeing it. This is where one of the most powerful memory fragments emerges. A magnificent structure with a cracked foundation. From the outside, everything appears stable. Yet the weakness exists underneath. Invisible. Ignored. Growing. The symbolic warning is profound. Collapse often begins long before anyone notices it. And the first sign is rarely external failure. The first sign is resistance to uncomfortable truth. This applies to relationships, organizations, governments, spiritual communities, and individual lives. The pattern remains remarkably consistent. The protector standing alone. The warning nobody wanted to hear. The moment realization arrives too late. These are not isolated events. They are recurring expressions of the same archetypal mechanism. Yet another. Revelation begins to emerge from beneath the surface. Perhaps the purpose of the white bone archetype was never to test perception. Perhaps perception was only the first layer. Perhaps the deeper test concerns identity itself. Can a person let go of an image that feels morally beautiful if reality demands it? Can they release certainty without falling into confusion? Can they abandon attachment without abandoning compassion? Those questions move the discussion beyond psychology and into the realm of spiritual transformation. Because awakening is not merely seeing reality. Awakening is surviving the death of illusions about oneself. And that realization changes the entire symbolic landscape. The conflict is no longer between illusion and truth. It becomes a conflict between truth and the self that wishes to remain unchanged. Which raises an even deeper mystery. If the greatest barrier is not deception, but attachment to identity, then why do so many spiritual seekers spend their lives strengthening the very self they are ultimately meant to see beyond? And what if the most important symbol in this entire structure is not the illusion that appears before us, but the version of ourselves that insists on interpreting it? So what is the final lesson hidden beneath all of these layers? What is the one thing most people miss when they approach this symbolic structure as a conflict between deception and discernment? The answer is surprisingly simple. The deepest struggle was never about recognizing illusion. It was about recognizing attachment. That is the core revelation. Because illusion is only a symptom. Attachment is the mechanism. And attachment itself is driven by something even deeper. Desire. The desire to remain psychologically intact. The desire to preserve a stable identity. The desire to protect a familiar interpretation of reality. Once that becomes visible, every symbolic layer suddenly aligns into a single pattern. Desire creates attachment. Attachment creates illusion. Illusion distorts perception. Distorted perception creates suffering. Suffering creates the opportunity for transformation. Transformation creates the possibility of awakening. This is not merely a narrative structure. It is a map of human consciousness. And that changes the role of every archetype involved. The white bone archetype is no longer simply a force that conceals truth. It becomes the force that exposes attachment. Its influence is not measured by how effectively it deceives. Its influence is measured by what it reveals about the observer. That is the hidden reversal. The most important information was never contained within the illusion. The most important information was contained within the reaction to the illusion. A warning nobody wanted to hear. A protector standing alone. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. These memory fragments now reveal a deeper meaning. They are not descriptions of events. They are diagnostic tools. They expose where attachment exists. They reveal what the mind is unwilling to surrender. And that is why the psychological function of this archetype extends far beyond individual behavior. Every organization has its white bone moment. Every institution has its white bone moment. Every civilization has its white bone moment. The moment when reality presents information that threatens identity. The moment when adaptation requires surrender. The moment when attachment becomes more valuable than truth. That is where decline begins. Not because external threats suddenly become stronger, but because perception becomes weaker. The symbolic consequence is enormous. A society that cannot question itself becomes fragile. A culture that cannot examine its assumptions becomes stagnant. A person who cannot challenge their self-image becomes trapped. In each case, the pattern remains identical. Attachment creates blindness. Blindness creates suffering. Suffering creates consequence. Yet Buddhist philosophy introduces a paradox that makes this revelation even deeper. The goal is not to destroy identity. The goal is not to reject compassion. The goal is not to eliminate morality. The goal is freedom from attachment to them. This distinction changes everything. Because attachment can disguise itself as virtue. Power can disguise itself as service. Fear can disguise itself as certainty. And suffering can disguise itself as security. Human beings often spend decades protecting the very structures that generate their suffering. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because the suffering feels familiar. The familiar feels safe. And safety feels more valuable than transformation. This is why awakening is portrayed so differently from achievement. Achievement accumulates. Awakening releases. Achievement strengthens structures. Awakening sees through structures. Achievement asks, how can I become more? Awakening asks, what am I still clinging to? That question reaches beyond psychology and into the foundation of human existence itself. Because the same mechanism appears everywhere. In personal identity. In political ideology. In religious institutions. In economic systems. In civilizations throughout history. Again and again, attachment transforms useful ideas into prisons. And once that happens, reality begins knocking at the door. Usually quietly. Usually indirectly. Usually through a truth nobody wants to hear. A magnificent structure with a cracked foundation. The image returns because it captures the entire revelation. The danger is not the crack. The danger is the refusal to look at it. And perhaps that is the deepest symbolic meaning hidden within this archetypal system. The greatest threat to awakening is not illusion. It is loyalty to the version of ourselves that requires the illusion to survive. If that is true, then an even larger consequence begins to emerge. Because the question is no longer whether individuals become trapped by attachment. The question becomes what happens when entire societies, entire civilizations, and entire generations build their identities upon illusions they can no longer afford to question. And if awakening requires letting go of what feels safest, what is the long-term cost of a world increasingly organized around protecting comforting identities instead of confronting reality? If attachment is the hidden mechanism, then the next question is unavoidable. What does attachment leave behind? What is its legacy? Not in a single person. Not in a single lifetime. But across generations, institutions, cultures, and civilizations. Because every psychological force leaves a footprint. Every illusion creates a consequence. And every consequence becomes part of a legacy that outlives the people who created it. This is where the symbolic significance expands far beyond the individual mind. The deepest consequence is not that people occasionally misjudge reality. The deepest consequence is that repeated misjudgment eventually becomes inherited perception. A child inherits assumptions. A community inherits narratives. A nation inherits stories about itself. Over time, these stories become invisible. Not because they are false. Not because they are true. But because nobody remembers to question them. That is how attachment evolves into culture. And culture eventually evolves into destiny. A magnificent structure with a cracked foundation. The image returns one more time because it captures the essence of symbolic legacy. Most people notice collapse when the walls begin to shake. Very few notice the decades spent ignoring the foundation. The legacy of attachment is not sudden failure. The legacy of attachment is gradual blindness. And gradual blindness is far more dangerous because it feels normal. That insight changes how we understand human history. Many civilizations did not disappear because they lacked intelligence. Many institutions did not fail because they lacked resources. Many communities did not fragment because they lacked good intentions. Often, they became prisoners of their own success. Their identity became fixed. Their assumptions became sacred. Their self-image became untouchable. And once that happened, adaptation became increasingly difficult. Not because reality stopped speaking, but because fewer people were willing to listen. A warning nobody wanted to hear. Notice how that memory fragment now operates at a civilizational scale. The warning is no longer directed at one person. It is directed at entire systems, entire cultures, entire generations. The warning remains available. The question is whether anyone is willing to recognize it. This is why the legacy of the archetype extends into modern life so naturally. Look at organizations that ignore internal criticism. Look at political movements that cannot tolerate self-examination. Look at online communities that reward agreement and punish nuance. Look at individuals who surround themselves only with people who confirm what they already believe. The technology changes. The mechanism remains identical. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. The symbolic pattern survives because it reflects something permanent about human nature. Human beings are remarkably capable of recognizing illusion in others. Far fewer can recognize illusion when it supports their identity. That asymmetry creates enormous consequences. Not only psychologically, not only socially, spiritually as well. Because the spiritual legacy of attachment is stagnation. When perception stops evolving, consciousness stops evolving. When consciousness stops evolving, suffering repeats itself in new forms. The names change. The circumstances change. The underlying mechanism remains. This is why Buddhist philosophy places such emphasis on awareness rather than certainty. Awareness remains flexible. Certainty becomes rigid. Awareness can learn. Certainty can only defend itself. And over long periods of time, that distinction determines whether a person grows or repeats. Whether a culture evolves or declines. Whether a civilization adapts or fractures. The protector standing alone. This memory fragment now reveals its final symbolic role. The protector is not merely a person. The protector is reality itself. Reality continuously offers feedback, consequences, corrections, signals, warnings. Most arrive quietly. Most arrive early. Most are ignored. The cost is rarely immediate, which is precisely why the cost becomes so large. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy hidden within this entire symbolic structure. Not that people are deceived. Not that societies make mistakes. Not even that suffering exists. The enduring legacy is that reality remains patient. Reality keeps presenting the lesson. Again and again. Across individuals. Across generations. Across civilizations. Until someone is finally willing to see. Yet one mystery still remains. If reality continually provides warnings, consequences, and opportunities for correction, why do some people awaken through those signals while others spend an entire lifetime defending themselves against them? And if the lesson is always present, what is the one thing that finally allows a human being to recognize it? Perhaps the answer is neither intelligence nor experience. Perhaps it is humility. Not humility in the social sense. Not modesty. Not self-deprecation. But the rare ability to remain open to reality even when reality refuses to confirm who we think we are. At the deepest level, that may be the enduring human lesson hidden within this archetypal structure. Because every person eventually encounters a moment when life presents a choice. Not between success and failure. Not between right and wrong. But between certainty and awareness. One path offers comfort. The other offers transformation. One preserves identity. The other expands consciousness. And the difference between those paths is often invisible in the beginning. That is why this symbolic pattern continues to resonate centuries after it was first imagined. It does not belong to a specific culture. It does not belong to a specific religion. It does not even belong to a specific era. It belongs to a permanent feature of human nature. The tendency to mistake familiarity for truth. The tendency to defend what feels safe. The tendency to protect the known self even when the known self has become a limitation. And yet there is something strangely hopeful hidden within that realization. Because the same human mind capable of attachment is also capable of awakening. The same consciousness that creates illusions can eventually recognize them. The same person who once resisted reality can learn to welcome it. Transformation remains possible. That is the legacy. Not perfection. Not certainty. Possibility. A warning nobody wanted to hear. The image remains. But now it means something different. It is no longer merely a warning about blindness. It is also a reminder that every ignored warning contains an invitation. An invitation to look again. To question again. To see again. A protector standing alone. That image remains as well. Not because protection always succeeds, but because truth continues to appear whether it is welcomed or not. Reality remains available. The invitation remains available. Awareness remains available. And perhaps that is why the symbolic structure never becomes obsolete. The forms change. The invitation does not. A truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. Perhaps this final memory fragment carries the deepest meaning of all. Because life rarely delivers wisdom in the form we expect. Wisdom does not always arrive through comfort. It does not always arrive through agreement. It does not always arrive through validation. Sometimes it arrives through discomfort. Sometimes through contradiction. Sometimes through the collapse of a cherished assumption. And sometimes through the quiet realization that what we resisted most intensely was the very thing we needed to understand. Seen from that perspective, the deepest conflict was never between opposing forces. It was between two different relationships with reality. One relationship seeks reassurance. The other seeks understanding. One asks reality to confirm existing beliefs. The other allows reality to transform them. That distinction extends beyond personal growth. It reaches into families, communities, institutions, civilizations, and ultimately into the spiritual dimension of human life itself. Because awakening is not simply acquiring new knowledge. Awakening is developing a new relationship with uncertainty. A relationship in which not knowing becomes more valuable than pretending to know. A relationship in which curiosity becomes stronger than attachment. A relationship in which awareness becomes more important than identity. And perhaps that is the final symbolic echo that remains after everything else falls away. The magnificent structure with a cracked foundation. The warning nobody wanted to hear. The protector standing alone. The truth that arrives wearing the face people distrust. None of these images are ultimately about a demon, a hero, or even a journey. They are reflections of a question that follows every human being throughout life. A question that becomes more important with age, experience, knowledge, and even wisdom. When reality finally asks us to choose between protecting the person we believe ourselves to be and discovering what is actually true, which one are we really prepared to let go of?